Good morning, folks. Welcome to the webinar. We're just letting people trickle in and hopefully you can hear us.
I'll wait for a minute or so. We like to start on time, but we recognize there's about a 2 minute grace, I think, between different Teams meetings and Zoom and all sorts of things. Um,
I say we get started.
yeah. Um, all right, so welcome everyone, and this is recorded too. So if we'd love you to share with your colleagues, of course, after the call. So I'm just going to start with some introductions. So I'm Tessa Dehring. I'm a principal at Nous Group. I'm one of your co-pilots of today's webinar. Also co-author of the article, which hopefully you've all had a chance to read, or if not, might be very curious to read after. And we talk about this concept of smart shocking. Melissa, why don't you first introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, so it's lovely to meet folks on the call today. My name is Melissa Padfield. I'm Deputy Provost, Students and Enrollment here at the University of Alberta. That's a title that doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but what it encompasses is I oversee our registrarial function, our Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, our International Education and Enrollment area, our Enrollment Services and Systems Design, as well as being able to oversee our Dean of Students area, which includes everything from counseling to student support. So it's about 600 employees that report up through me at the University of Alberta. And for those not aware of what the University of Alberta is, we are R1 equivalent institution in Canada, member of the U15 group, which is similar to the Russell Group for folks that are located in the UK. And we have about 46,000 students.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And so I'm principal, as I mentioned, from Nous Group. Nous, we're a management consulting firm primarily across Canada, UK, and Australia. I am Australian, but I do live in Canada. That can be off-putting. So I've been here for about 2 years. I'm an organizational psychologist by background, very passionate about leadership development. I co-lead our organizational performance and leadership practice across Nous, and I'm particularly interested in how can we continue to evolve our ways of doing leadership development to fit within the rhythms of work. And so, that's really at the heart of the conversation today. Before we do get into the webinar, I would like to do a land acknowledgement as I am here based in Toronto. So I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I also recognize that this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13. And I feel really privileged that I've been able to call this land home for the last couple of years and future years. So in terms of the webinar today and what's in store, so we're going to start with a couple of questions for you so we get a chance to see who's in the room. Melissa and I will then talk through background behind the concept of, we have a funky title, Smart Shocking. Where did it come from? And you'll learn, and Melissa and I talked about this in preparation for the webinar. This feels like Melissa and I are going to be having a chat for the next 45 minutes. And we've got a lot of people here on the ride with us. So we'll share a bit of background. We'll talk a little bit about the key concepts really that underpins smart shocking and the concept. And then we've also put together a couple of case studies just to provide, really make this real for you. We will save quite a lot of time at the end for questions. The other thing that we have done and will do is provide our contact details. Because one thing that Melissa and I are really passionate about is collaborating on ideas, refining and evolving the concepts that we're thinking about. And so we'd really welcome each of you to collaborate with us on that. I would also just make a note to say we know research shows that we aren't great at multitasking, so we're not going to have the chat function on today, but we do ask you to provide thoughts, questions through the Q&A function at the bottom. And so when we get to the Q&A section, we'll make sure that we talk through any questions that have come through. And of course, the door is open for further discussion following this. So Melissa, I might hand to you to talk us through where did smart shocking come from?
Yeah, so Tessa, as she alluded, we really like to talk about leadership development. And we were thinking about, and particularly myself, thinking about how I could support more senior leaders in their development. We get to a point in time where leaders think they should have it all figured out, all the soft skills should be known. And as the folks charged with supporting them or facilitating work, we often just hold space to deal with the day-to-day issues, as opposed to thinking really intentionally about how do you get the best out of folks that are already at a very senior level of development. And so as Tess and I were talking, we started thinking about pressure testing, right? And when do people really thrive and start to develop in ways that were unfamiliar to them in the past? And so we were in a relationship talking about how a new structure, a new organizational structure could function at the University of Alberta and how we would get it to work optimally. And we had two really great senior leaders coming to this space to try and work through some new challenges. And what we noticed is that when we were able to see the developmental shock happen, that we could really be intentional about, there was an opportunity for growth that wasn't found in sort of traditional training. And so we started thinking about, well, what does it look like to shock the system in a way that can allow senior people to develop more intentionally in the spaces that they may not get a chance to, or that they haven't had to, particularly in higher ed, where folks are coming from sort of an academic lens, where they've spent the majority of their career really refining a skill set that doesn't always translate fully into sort of the administrative leadership space. And they want to be able to be as effective as possible. So how can we support that more effectively? And we thought, well, that sort of productive agitation is a place where a lot of development happens. And this started to burgeon the idea of smart shocking and how we could be intentional about fostering growth and development in a space where pressure testing could be used not just to create stress, but to actually extend learning. Yeah, so I think we're going to go from there and talk a little bit more about what the concept is, the details of it, who can benefit from it, and how this isn't just regular coaching. So we've got some slides that we'd like to share with you. And thanks for the comment in the chat. We'll try and make sure that we're speaking a little bit more slowly so that folks are able to follow what we're doing. And please feel free to give us feedback in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to monitor it as we go along. So what is smart shocking? Go to the next slide. So when we think about shocking, it really is an intentional leadership development process. We've all been thrown into the deep end in our careers, and in retrospect, often can really appreciate the kind of development that could happen through that kind of a disequilibrium that gets fostered. The difference in a smart shocking approach is that it's intentional prior to the shock, and it follows intentionality all the way through to the debrief of the shock that can happen. You can also leverage both manufactured as well as naturally occurring shocks. So things that happen in your day to day, I think we're all inundated with shocks that have happened to the system, whether it is the loss of public confidence in higher education, whether we're looking at funding shocks that happen from across the globe, whether there's geopolitical instability. These are naturally occurring shocks to the whole systems that we work within. But there's also the opportunity to manufacture shocks, be put on projects that stretch and extend our learning based on the things that those who supervise us identify, as well as those things we identify for ourselves. So you're able to leverage that, and it can be built into a day-to-day experience. I think one of the things that goes by the wayside when the tyranny of the urgent really comes to bear is the ability to take time for intentional leadership development. So when you can build in a kind of process that really allows you to have it run alongside the work that you have to accomplish from day to day, that can be really powerful. And it's something that Tessa and I talked a lot about, is how do we take what is happening as far as the momentum of a particular moment in time for a leader and use it intentionally to be able to extend development. And one of the key features of a shock is really to push people outside their comfort zone. When we're reflecting on this, I think a lot of us have had that extended moment, but have we always had the support and intentionality around the moment of a shock or discomfort or disquiet that has allowed us to get the most out of it? So intentional, built into the day-to-day, pushing people outside the comfort zone that they naturally occupy. We all gravitate to those spaces of comfort. And how do we use real experiences in a way that can be as productive as possible? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about smart shocking, as opposed to just rolling with the punches. Next slide. So who benefits from this technique? Honestly, I think anyone can benefit from this technique. We've started thinking about it really focused on senior leaders, folks that believe they should have it all figured out, but really do also want to extend their development in ways that perhaps are not wholly obvious all the time as to how you would do it. Foundational leadership courses may not speak directly to this group, but they're looking for ways in which to improve and that continuous improvement. I was thinking about some of the smart shocks that have happened to me in my career, and they really have happened at all stages of development. I can think back to times when I was a graduate student and I was thrown into the deep end to go speak on behalf of my supervisor at the time and be the expert in the room. Now, she was using smart shocking, not in a way that she knew she was, but it certainly helped me. I had support before, during, and after in ways that allowed me to reflect on a process that gave me a lot in terms of my own development and confidence. I've again encountered that when I was sort of at a middle management level, when I was thrown onto a project to lead cross-institutionally for the first time, and was able to really think about how much that agitation that came with taking on a project much outside my comfort zone was supported with key learning and intentionality as I identified things that felt really uncomfortable or new frontiers. And then at that senior level, I think that is where it becomes some of the most useful, whether it's the president, whether it's a vice president, or whether it's a dean. These moments in time really lend themselves to shocks that can be used. It also isn't something exclusive to higher education. While I think higher education can benefit from it a lot because you take people from one context and you jettison them into a completely different leadership context without what I would call sort of the working up through the organization that often happens in other sectors, it's something that I think can be used anywhere. And it can also be used for different parts of the performance continuum. I think for folks that are high achievers, this can be a great way to allow them to extend development and move beyond sort of the platitudes of regular performance evaluations that tend to say, oh, you're doing a great job, just keep going. This gives something concrete to attach to. But for those struggling with performance, it allows their supervisor or leader to really target development in ways that are wholly intentional. So what's different than just regular coaching? I think actually one of the first things, and we haven't put this on the slide, but that this can become very two-way. So when you're using a shocking process, the supervisor that is helping to support someone through a shock can also in a way have a reverberation of a shock for themselves, where they identify spaces and places that allow them to be a better supervisor for the leader that they're helping to support. So unlike regular coaching, I think it goes two ways and development can actually extend across the continuum of support. It also brings an intentionality to a situation that often would be discussed as part of a management process. So instead of just looking at how we survive through an issue or how we manage to the end and conclusion of that issue, we're actually adding a layer to looking at this particular shock or moment in time that focuses on growth and development. You also build it into the rhythm of how issues emerge, right? With a pre-phase, and Tessa will talk about this, that allows us to know what we're looking for as a pressure comes or as a shock is encountered, and then really allowing through the rhythm of trial and error, various techniques throughout that shock, we're building in a mindset shift that allows for regular reflection that differentiates from just managing through. And then there really is a huge, strong focus on both debrief and personal reflection that runs alongside, again, the management of the issue. So it becomes quite distinct in that two-way communication, a two-way benefit to both the supervisor and the leader, as well as an intentionality that runs the course of the particular issue that's being dealt with at that moment in time.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to talk. So a few people have joined too. Don't worry, we are recording. So if you've missed the start, you'll be able to watch it back. And feel free to, as we're talking through the content today, feel free to put some Q&A questions in, and we'll come back to them. So in terms of the process here, you'll see there are essentially three phases, and Melissa's alluded to these as part of the introduction. So I'm just going to step through each one, talk about some of the key features, and of course, there's a lot more information in the article, but also very happy to provide more detail through the further discussion. So in terms of the pre-shock, so in terms of the three, we've got a pre-shock, the smart shock, and then the post-shock. And then starting with the pre-shock, really this is about planning. What's really interesting is that this pre-shock may not even be visible to the leader in question or experiencing the shock, because as we know, there will be situations where we call them natural shocks, but they might just be in the shock. And then what happens is it's about how do you experience that shock in the most effective way, and what really do you do in the post-shock activities. But for those that we call manufactured shocks, this is probably a bit more of a planning phase. The other thing I would emphasize is the importance of regular conversations around development goals, career aspirations, because the more that you do that just naturally means that you're almost doing a lot of the work in the pre-shock phase. You're setting up that leader well for this natural shock. And also when we think about manufacturing or creating a shock for someone, if we know the development goals, the career trajectory, it's much easier to then think about, okay, well, what type of shock might I need to develop for this person? And so in this phase, we're looking at what's the leader's capability and capacity, what are the contexts that that leader's working in, what might be their growth, opportunities or trajectory even in the coming period. And so, of course, visibility of this is different, but just wanted to emphasize that the pre-shock does differ depending on whether, of course, it's a natural or manufactured shock. Always up for feedback on the terms that we're using here too. Melissa and I went through various names of what we call these. So then in terms of the smart shock, we put a table in the article that provided essentially three levels of risk. There's lots of different ways that we can think about what actually is a shock, but fundamentally it's about they vary in intensity, in potential risk, and form. So for instance, you might have there might be a strategic rethink, or perhaps there's a planned disruption, some high stake projects or business model improvements. And when I'm saying that, a lot of those might look similar to regular and intentional growth opportunities. The difference of the shock is that it's meant to be a shock or experience that fosters a greater degree of, we call it disequilibrium or challenge, to accelerate growth. And so what that means is the matching of the activity to where that leader is in terms of their capability, capacity, and their development becomes really important. And so we'll talk more about that in the case studies as well. The other really important thing is that they're supposed to provide more, like a high level exposure to a high level of risk and intensity than regular on the job learning opportunities. And we will see perhaps those leaders that are settling into the role, you might give them a shock that kind of takes them to the next level. But for those that are sort of high potential, we're looking at more and more higher intensity shocks, if you like. And it's important. The other key thing to note here is the success of the shock is actually not about whether or not the outcome of the initiative or the goals were achieved, but success of a shock is really about the leader gaining growth and development to be better positioned in the future. So some of our best shocks actually will be failures, and that's okay. And what's really important there is the post-shock process in reflection around that. One final thing is that smart shocks might be prolonged. And so some of these experiences might be multi-year experiences. And so in that case, when we think about our post-shock, there might be some in-progress shock activities that the supervisor needs to do. And for others, there might be single event or situation. So perhaps one thing that the leader does and then reflects on it. So quite a lot of variability in the type of shock. And the reason that's deliberate, because we know everyone learns a bit differently. People are all at their own development, stage and leadership stage. So we want to make sure that we wanted to design an approach that's actually quite flexible. And as Melissa said, really focused on senior leader development, but actually really useful for everyone.
And I just
So
wanted to add one
yeah,
piece
please
to
jump
that
in.
too.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think I would challenge folks on the webinar to think about is this is really a risk mitigation process. So if we think about what is our greatest tool to mitigate risk in a high uncertainty environment, which I think we're all experiencing right now, it's personal development and leadership development. Having leaders that are able to leverage the outcomes of shocks that can foster a zone of disequilibrium for those that they support in a way that's productive. This is massively important to risk mitigation in a complex environment. So we spend a lot of time on risk registers, and we have, our ISO standards, and we talk about velocity, and we talk about likelihood, and we talk about consequence. And all of that needs and necessitates having individuals at a leadership phase that can really activate their skill sets effectively. And so spending time using risk to actually mitigate risk by developing skills is something that I think all institutions really need to pay attention to. And it's the way in which we can bring this kind of three-phased intentionality to those spaces that can help with risk mitigation. So I challenge you to think about putting this through the lens of risk management and the important and essentialism of individuals and their development in that risk management.
Great addition. Thanks, Melissa. And I think that really emphasized the importance of, there are, we can run into sort of attitudes around development being an extra. But I think when you frame it in the risk context, it's an absolute must do. And so that's a really, particularly if we've got people on the call that are wanting to drive changes in their own institutions, how, framing this around a risk lens can be really effective. In terms of the post-shock period, so this is the time we want to move on. We've done that, and Melissa and I reflected on shocks that we've been through. It's the shock has been dealt with. I've come out the other end, and I just want to move on to something else. This is where we can't move on. It's the primus point for learning. I'm sure we can all think about that time we've gone through a difficult period, and we just want to forget about it. But this is where we get the most value out of the shock, and this is where it's really quite distinct to a on-the-job learning experience. Because I think even on reflection of my own practice or perhaps practice with teams, Melissa and I both connected, on we could continue to do better in terms of how we debrief, what questions we ask. And so we were quite deliberate in how we thought about this post-shock phase and the role of the supervisor. The other really important thing is it can be really hard to be in a reflection phase when we're under stress and in challenge. And so the post-shock we have that period of kind of release where we just want to move on, but actually it's a really good reflection stage. So we just wanted to really hone in on that. And the supervisor playing a key role here. And it's more than a debrief and coaching. It's really a structured exploration. So we've put some ideas here. We want to keep experimenting with what works, what questions are great. So our ask for you on the webinar is to help us explore this concept and give us feedback around what you learn and what works. We're positioning this around 3 levels. And so having a conversation with the leader around how do they learn about themselves as a leader? So how they showed up. What did they learn about how they lead others? And then what was the broader impact on the institution? Either from what, directly from their leadership or from, how the situation landed or how it was dealt with. And then finally, which isn't on the slide, it's really about asking that leader, what skills would you have liked or knowledge or skills, would you have liked to feel more confident about how you could manage that situation with less stress? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the case study. But really what we're trying to do there is get it, think about what we did well, what we could do differently, but then also think about how do we continue to set ourselves up for success when we're faced with challenge. And the answer to that and the skill profile will depend on the different challenge. And the intent there is that we should always probably have a skill or knowledge or something that we thought, I wish that I knew that before I experienced this shock. So we're essentially layering on lots of different skill development as a result of this reflection. The supervisor role is absolutely key here. And particularly if the supervisor has had some exposure or visibility on how that leader has responded to the shock, because we can then draw on how did you see yourself showing up? And then the supervisor going, well, actually, I saw you show up this way. And looking at whether, how that's similar or different is really, really effective. Also, you'll see in the article referred to peer groups. There is an opportunity in the post-shock phase engaging with those that were on the shock ride journey with them, thinking about their team that might have been involved or influenced, or other kind of stakeholders that were in the mix. And so that does require a bit of vulnerability and openness, but it's a really nice place to kind of get further reflections and other data points for that leader to go, I thought I presented this way. Is that the experience that others had of me? Melissa, anything that you want to add on the post shock?
I think one of the things is once you have these in your mind, whether you're the person being shocked or helping support the shock, you can kind of do an inventory in your head. And taking it from your head to a conversational stance actually lets you then figure out what actions can be generalized across the next time you encounter something similar. So it's really important to also run yourself through these questions, but really give voice to them in relationship with either your supervisor or your supervisor giving voice to them with you. That's that two-way dialogue that I think actually allows this work to be generalized across the next type of scenario or your overall leadership development. So giving voice, I think, is critical around all of these different dimensions.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And I know that we have different profiles of people either on the webinar now or watching it back. And so, when you look at this process and you're perhaps the supervisor or the leader of the leader, still haven't found the perfect term for that. You are thinking about, how do I create this shock process for someone that I'm leading, a leader that I'm leading. You might also be looking at this process going, I am the leader that wants to be shocked. How do I set this up with my supervisor, or even how do I shock myself? And then we also know that we've got a profile of people that maybe are not are trying to influence leadership uplift in their institutions. And so, how do you actually socialize this process with senior leaders within your institution on, hey, have you thought about, this concept of smart shocking? And so, we know that people are coming to this conversation from different lenses, and just would say, depending, the beauty of it being quite flexible is that that the process can be either something that you're driving or also just giving exposure to others. And finally, we would be reluctant to share this without some theory. So I just wanted to close in terms of, why does this work, or our theory behind why this works. And Ronald Heifetz coined this term, the productive, and it's very, very jargony, but bear with me. It's the productive zone of disequilibrium. And fundamentally, it's really about getting in that right zone of stress. And so we talk a lot about, you would have heard the terms eustress. And what this diagram shows, you can kind of see, is there is a real sweet spot when we're under enough challenge or pressure, and that we find ourselves in this threshold of learning. And so we call that the productive learning zone. If we go too far, we don't learn, we get overwhelmed, we shut down, and it's not a learning experience. So getting in that threshold of learning is a really important thing. And if we're underneath that threshold of learning, it's a bit too cold, if you like. So we're a bit demotivating. We don't necessarily lean into the experience. And so the reason we share this is the whole idea of kind of matching the leadership shock to where that leader is, helps us understand, what type of shock do we give them to get them in this threshold of learning. And that zone looks different for every leader. So my zone would look different to Melissa's zone. Different things might put me in that threshold of learning, and also the too hot phase than Melissa and others on the call. And so you've really got to be intentional as a supervisor, if you're creating these shocks, to really understand the person that you're designing this for, or the person that is experiencing the shock, to make sure that you're giving them the right level of support to keep them in that threshold. Melissa, anything that you want to add? I see you
Yeah,
leaning in.
leaning in. This doesn't happen through happenstance, right?
Mm.
I think this is where the intentionality on the part of the supervisor, and I think we actually all have to own that we are supervisors. And I think that is a label that becomes quite uncomfortable when you're in a very senior role, right? We want to see ourselves as facilitators of highly skilled folks that are doing really important jobs, rather than supervisor, which seems like I'm a taskmaster, right? But I think when we can bring intentionality back to our role as a leader of leaders or as a supervisor, that allows us to be very adaptive in these moments. So you can see the agitation creep up to the point where the person you're supporting is blocked. right? So that adaptive component requires a lot of attention, and it requires a keen investment of time on the part of a leader who also may be very busy to really attend to what is going to keep that threshold of learning. And again, I'll go back to what's our ultimate goal as leaders is it to be able to develop the people around us to be able to move the work. And so spending time on helping folks stay in that threshold of learning is actually super critical for being able to drive your laundry list of pressures and tasks, right? So that you're able to build out a team that can do this. And I think holding space for folks to get outside of the threshold learning zone for a little while, everybody needs a bit of a spin out from time to time. And then knowing how and when to pull it back into learning is really important. And so transparency and vulnerability from both the supervisor and the leader in question going into that zone is really critical. And communication cannot be overstated in terms of importance on keeping folks in that productive zone so you can really harness where that creativity will come. And I'll just share a little anecdote. I have a group of leaders. I think some are actually on this call today. And we were trying to innovate around some of our strategies on service delivery. And we actually spent an hour, what I would call in the really hot zone, because there were some pressure points that were really creating a challenge for us. And as we worked ourselves through that, through a series of sort of questions that were posed to the group, we were able to bring the temperature down in the entire group back into what I would call a learning threshold that allowed us to innovate much more productively. So sometimes going out of the band or under the band for a little bit actually allows you as the supervisor to see what kind of question and pressure you might apply to be able to get folks back into that zone. And so you can do it with groups, not just with individuals. And I think that's something important to remember and adapt to in those moments.
Thanks, Melissa. And you drew on a really important point there. You've got to put your toe into the too hot zone to know where the too hot zone is, and then find yourself back. The same with the too cold. So, yeah, so that's important to understand as a leader. You'll probably often need to be in that hot zone to go, okay, I'm too hot. How do we take the temperature down? So really nice point there. We do have a question in the chat around examples of shock. So I think it's a great time to move to the case study. So Melissa, I'm going to hand to you to talk through case study one.
Yeah. So case study one, and I'm going to say this is an amalgam of 4 instances that have happened within the last 6 months. So this is something that hopefully will feel quite familiar to folks. And my case study is around the shock that happens to you, not necessarily the manufactured shock, though you can manufacture this shock if it's something that you feel the leader that you're supporting would benefit from. So we've all been charged with trying to communicate something to a broader, more diverse group at a more senior level at some point in our careers. And that more senior can happen at any level of the organization, right? When you're really just charged to step up and out across a number of different folks to try and communicate for impact. And we always will take our preparation and understanding about how communication has worked in the past into those moments, right? We take our prior learning, we generalize it to our moment that we have, and it doesn't always land as expected. That's happened to me on more occasions than I would like to admit, and I'm sure it's happened to many folks on this call. That creates a lot of disequilibrium when your preparation doesn't meet your expectations in terms of how it's received by the community you're trying to motivate to action. And so when that happens, it is a perfect opportunity for the relationship between a supervisor and the leader they're supporting to work through a shock process. Leaders that care about their communication will have put a lot of effort into this. So in essence, you have a willing participant often for folks that have done a lot of preparation in their communication. But what will happen is it's very hard when the reception to that is either suspicion, critique, disengagement. That's how you'll start to learn that this is becoming a shock and not just a standard sort of move through the motions of trying to communicate an issue. When that happens, either you're going to have witnessed it as the supervisor, or it's going to come to you from the person that you're supporting with a lot of agitation. This isn't working. Why aren't people getting on board? Why isn't the buy-in that I'm trying to foster happening in the way that I'm expecting? And it's a perfect opportunity then to focus on that shock process and really refocus people on what was the goal and outcome that you were seeking? How did you show up there? Did you become progressively more agitated? Were you able to edit for the audience that you had? Because often, and a colleague of mine always gave this great example, as you move through the organization, you move from being the Excel spreadsheet of details to the Word document summary to the single slide to then really the tweet, right? And so maybe this is the moment at which we're able to think about how do we move up through those levels of communication for more efficacy, rather than feeling like it's a failure. I got it wrong. This isn't working. This is a moment to actually reinvigorate how you might approach communication differently to a different category of folks that want a different type of communication. And so again, it requires us to slow down to speed up. You have to slow down through the what parts of the communication weren't working, how we reorient and show learning visibly. So one of the things that taking an intentional approach to this shocking process can do is it can allow the leader in question to show the learning process to those around them, which can actually help to reorient the impact of what they're trying to push, particularly in areas of communication, where you're taking in the feedback, you're working through it with your supervisor around the pieces you need to learn from this moment, and then you're showcasing how you've built back in feedback to what you'll communicate going forward. That learning process creates an opening for vulnerability, it creates an opening for learning, and it also helps the leader in question figure out a more effective means of communication in the go forward. So that takes a lot of different pieces of what we're calling the shocking process into account. The pre-shock could be whether you knew that this was something you were going to struggle with or not. I would say in most cases, this kind of a communicating for impact shock is not something that folks are aware is a gap until it happens, right? Which really pushes people into that hot zone of disequilibrium pretty quickly. So being able to calm that mechanism and focus again on what the impact was intended to be, how that learning can be made visible, how to draw on the strengths that individual already possesses around building buy-in at a lower level, and then implementing new strategies for a higher order and a broader order of communication really does allow people to reorient a moment that can feel like a failure into something that can feel like a win and is something that will take them forward into that next level of executive leadership in ways that can be highly impactful. So that's one area that I think is probably pretty common in the shocks that we've all experienced that allows you to really implement this process from an unanticipated shock.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And if there are any questions about that case, feel free to pop them in the Q&A as well. I'm going to talk us through a tale of two leaders. And so this is an example of a manufactured shock, as we like to call it. And the context for this case study, imagine you're an executive level administrative leader, and you've got and this is very common, you've got different levels of leadership experience and capacity and capability in your team. And so we're calling this the tale of two leaders to show often we're going to be in situations where we're wanting to create shocks, not just for perhaps one leader, but for two in this scenario, and also two very different leaders. So we thought this could be a nice way of showing different types of shocks. And so, in terms of our leaders, so leader one is a high potential leader, experienced director. You can see has many strengths and development opportunities. And so, what we sometimes see in high potential leaders is the supervisor of this leader can see all of those potential characteristics. That person might not see them themselves, perhaps hasn't had as much exposure to challenging senior leaders, and also struggling a little bit with workload. And so the shock here we've devised for this director, and we know that a lot of institutions are going through this at the moment, is leading a whole university transformation project for the administrative function or area, I should say. And so the executive level leader has said basically we have this really big, important work that needs to be done. I can't, like, I'm not in the place to lead that. I need someone that's got the potential to lead it. It isn't an everyday learning and development experience, running a whole of university transformation project. So what it means is, if we think about the high potential leader, is we're putting them in that learning zone because it's a shock that's going to push them up more than sort of day to day. The other features that are really important is it's a prolonged shock. And so for those that are high potential, we're wanting to really push having prolonged shocks, which have essentially multiple mini or major shocks throughout them. If you imagine running a university transformation, you're dealing with shocks every day. And so we're really trying to put that leader, because they've got the high potential, they're striving, they're ready for more. We're putting them in a prolonged shock and we're also involving many stakeholders. And so you can see one of the development opportunities is around challenging senior leaders, having opportunities to engage across the institution. And so this one's trying, one, to build on strengths around having good relationships, but also focusing on development areas. And so the executive leader would be thinking about, okay, how can I also create moments within this shock that really help this leader to develop their development opportunities. And so, you know that we mentioned this earlier about actually having answers to what are the leader's strengths and what are their development opportunities are one of the most important things in designing what shock you give them. And so you can see the role of the exec leader in this case will be providing opportunities for the director to almost be in their place where we see there's maybe difficulty or potential frictions. And also, if we think about the post shock, this would be a continuous debrief model. And so the executive leader in this case needs to think about, how do I create regular forums for this leader to come to me and us to essentially be debriefing and post-shocking over that prolonged period of time. That ensures that, of course, we're getting the balance right. The reason I share that too is you can see, and we'll talk about the next leader, but you can start to see that the executive leader role really needs to be customized to the type of shock we're talking about. And so on the right, we've got the leadership lift. So this is someone else in this executive leader's portfolio, good performer, strong technically, strong relationships with team and peers, very likable, some really nice strengths. Development opportunities, though, quite still developing in their leadership role. So has opportunity to hold team more accountable, to drive quality service, modernization activities that they want to deliver in the function, and likes to play in the technical work, perhaps doesn't always like to think, or play in the strategic space, or perhaps haven't developed the skills to do that yet. And so there are opportunities to be more inspirational in terms of their leadership approach. So the shock here isn't leading a whole of university transformation, because we probably find they're in the too hot zone. And so it's actually about, for this one, it's more focused. And so when we think about the table that we put together and thinking about the shock, a bit lower risk, because this person's not necessarily starting at that same level as the high potential leader, and each leader will start on different levels. But you can see the shock's a little bit more focused. It's a business model improvement. It's in one area of their function, and it's particularly in an area that they don't have technical expertise, because that's where they love to play. And because of the niceties, this leader has trouble sometimes holding their teams accountable. And so we're putting them in a shock zone where it's more aligned to where they are as a leader. It's time bound. So you can see the prolonged shock wouldn't be the right thing to do with this leader. It'd probably be too overwhelming. And again, if we think of the diagram, we're getting into the hot zone. So time-bounded shock, really aimed at driving both the personal and team transformation. The really important thing here, and I know the shock isn't about what's delivered, but the beauty of this shock is driving both improvements in the work and that team, as well as a leadership transformation. And so wherever we can couple both of those together, given we've got not much time, and we know institutions are trying to make a lot of changes, the better. Finally, the role of the executive leader is different. So this probably would follow a more straightforward during, post-shock process, and then the coaching throughout might be more, we imagine be focused on overcoming roadblocks in the day-to-day, but really the post-shock would be once they've kind of landed on these changes within the business function, really looking back and going, okay, how did I show up? What did I learn? Where did I find roadblocks? And what does this mean, particularly in the skill gap that I need as a leader? The beauty of something like this too is sometimes we don't know what we don't know at times, and putting someone into this shock helps them go, oh, actually, I noticed I struggled with maybe communication, like what you said, Melissa, or I struggled actually in the technical zone, or helping the team problem solve. And so out of this kind of experience, you can then get a few different development goals or areas for this leader that they've come up with themselves. because they've gone in, they've experienced and said, oh, I feel like I've had a bit of a gap in that space. I could have done better. And so that's really what we're looking for in that shock. Now, the reason we put two side by side is to show that the shock needs to be matched to the leader, and hopefully that shows you, some examples of that. And the intensity of shocks can differ and need to be matched where the leaders are at. And the executive leader role or the leader's role will differ depending on the type of shock we're talking about. Melissa, anything that you wanted to add on that one?
No, I think I'm good to open it up for some questions and probing from our
Great.
audience, and hopefully they've got good thoughts for us.
And if we haven't done justice on the Q&A question about examples of shocks, we could absolutely elaborate on that. So feel free to pop it in again. Yeah. So we just give you a moment. So in the Q&A, feel free to drop your question in, and then we'll move to that.
I think one of the things that really motivated Tessa when we were talking about this is the fact that how do you use what is the reality of day-to-day life for some purpose that is more intentional and more positive in development, right? So I think we can find a lot of time where we perseverate on the struggle as opposed to figuring out that struggle needs to be normalized and actually adapted to in a way that can be developmental. And so it's a real reframe for even supervisors around how they navigate struggle to not be a nuisance where they need to help people get through it so you can move on to the next thing, but rather thinking about struggle as a key component of their work. And how in supporting struggle through something like a shock is actually a good use of time because it's helping to develop core skills that can then help for ongoing success in the areas of accountability that a particular leader has, which I think actually can bring a lot of joy to what can be a difficult situation for the folks that are experiencing it and really help to enhance the relationship between the two parties that are working together as a supervisor and a leader. Could a senior leader put themselves intentionally through a shock and then set up a peer group to support and debrief the process? Yes. So I think another core concept, and I'll just kick off, Tessa, and then turn over
Yeah.
to you, is really around agency, right? And so I think the most powerful leaders, the leaders that have the best impact on their organizations, are the ones who are always looking for ways to reclaim and activate agency in their own practice in ways that can help them to be more effective. And so if you don't have a relationship with a supervisor who would be either effective or interested in helping you through a shocking process, I think being able to discern whether it's in a thought partnership with someone else, an area that you really want to work on, then putting yourself in the position to be shocked or in responding to a shock that has come to you through an experience like a presentation that didn't land, through an accountability that's been hoisted upon you that you feel ill prepared to do. You can then set up a group to help you debrief that. And you can give folks sort of this roadmap. These are the kinds of questions I'd like you to help me think through and probe on. And I think that's a really good way to return agency to something that can feel like it's happening to you and really be able to use it as a learning enhancement opportunity.
Yeah, and only thing I would add is the role of the supervisor in that. Like I think it's great to have the peer group, but I think also thinking about what could the supervisor, your leader's role be in that, even if you're primarily focusing on the peer group support in this example, even what is the ask for you of your leader in supporting that. And so just in terms of how you might design that. But the thing I really love about that is we want to design a process, an approach that's flexible. And we know that people have different relationships with their supervisors. Their supervisors have different, time availability, and we don't want we don't want leaders to be in the case where they don't get a shock because they're kind of waiting for their leaders to have time. So I love that as a concept. The next question we've got, Melissa, is around. Oh, sorry. Do you want to add anything there?
Nope, I'm good.
So we have a question around, are there any potential risks to a smart shock approach? And one that I might kick us off with, and maybe we can tag team a little bit here, Melissa, is I think for me, it's about the type of shock, making sure that we've got the right shock, if we think of that diagram, to get people in the learning zone. Because if we get people in if you don't design the smart shock to in light of the leader's development goals and strengths, we might find the shocks too cool. And then what happens is the leader goes, oh, I put all that effort in to this shock, but I didn't really get into that learning zone, or it wasn't, I didn't get the impact that perhaps I was searching for. And if we put people in the too hot a zone, we know that we still potentially closed off to learning. So for me, it's like really understanding the strengths and development goals, because if you skip to kind of designing the shock without that, you might just find that we don't put people in the right zone. But Melissa, what other risks do you think there are?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is it relates exactly to what you've said is getting the shock wrong, right? And the
Mm,
skill set of both the supervisor and the leader in question are really essential to having them targeted at the right level, right? So if you have a supervisor that's like, oh, look, a shock, and just starts asking you a bunch of questions about what you're learning through that shock and doesn't know how to help right the ship or give support in a way that keeps you in a productive zone of learning, as opposed to sort of feeling like you're being hung out to dry or feeling like you're being pushed beyond your limits in ways that you're not able to meet the challenge of. So it turns into a real feeling of failure as opposed to a feeling of learning. That is a risk, right? So it does require a really deep level of engagement and also self-awareness on the part of the supervisor, to be able to foster this kind of a shock process. Shocks are going to happen regardless of whether we're implementing this process or not. So again, we're trying to put agency and intentionality around something that is, of course, of regular life for any leader. So the risk really is that it just is the shock and not the smart part. And the smart part requires a lot of intentionality and skill set for both the supervisor and the leader to help work through that collaboratively. And so it can have risk, but it also has, I think, reward when the risk is well managed. All right, I think we have another one, which is, can you share a bit more about how leaders can dip their toes into smart shocking? So I think the first thing is actually to get to know the people that you supervise. And I know that sounds trite. I think a lot of folks have good relationships with the folks they supervise, but I think it's very easy, particularly as folks get more senior, to kind of absolve ourselves as supervisors of needing to be active in their development. We kind of turn the keys over entirely to the individual because they're smart, they're capable, they're successful, and we don't think about being intentional about where gaps may exist and engaging in that really honest conversation for self-identification of leadership opportunities on the part of a leader in question, and also support opportunities on the part of those who help to manage more senior folks. So I think the first place to dip your toe into smart shocking is actually just to try and have a conversation about areas of development, and to think about for yourself as a supervisor, even just doing a bit of a matrix on the folks that you support around what are the areas of development, and layering that against the kind of opportunities that are coming down the road for your organization that might lend themselves to intentional shocks, or ones that you can foresee being shocks that that individual will encounter, and starting to match those up even in your own head as a supervisor. That brings intentionality back to a process, and that's a good place to dip your toe in. So at least you're prepared mentally for what the value of particular shocks might be for different folks in your organization.
great, thanks, Melissa. The other thing I would add is experimentation. And so thinking about is there one, so you've reflected on the development strengths and opportunities in your team. Is there one person in that team that you actually go and trial the process with? See what you learn, what they learn, and so a big thing would be just start small. And then if you're in the situation where you're more of an enabler of this process or trying to get other leaders to do it, it's again, think about what little experiment might you do. Is there a leader, like say I'm thinking if you're in a people function or so on, is there a leader that you know that actually can say, hey, I've got this idea, I'd love you to trial it in your team and give us some feedback, and let's see how this works in our context. And so just would encourage, if we think of, there's the leader, you as the leader yourself, thinking about what shocks you maybe could experiment with. It's you as the leader of the leaders, thinking about maybe one of those leaders to trial something, and then we've got the people that are kind of enabling or influencing this practice. And so there's something actually experimental for everyone in those different zones.
And transparency. Don't be stealthy about your
Yeah.
shocking. I think it's really important to acknowledge if you are thinking about a manufactured shock, something that you think will be a stretch experience for someone, or really help them to develop, articulate why. and what, and actually seek their engagement in that. I think nobody likes to think that someone is puppet mastering things behind the scene. And I always think transparency in a leadership relationship is so fundamental. And so I would say that goes back to sort of the risk question as well as the dipping your toe in question, that you really want to be intentional and achieve some level of consent between the supervisor and the leader around using this process intentionally as opposed to just responsively to a shock that may occur.
I think they're all the questions that we've got for now that I can see. So thank you for those questions, and we want to keep this conversation going. So I'm just going to share our contact details. Hopefully that's come up for everyone.
Tessa, we also got a question
Oh,
that
great.
says, from a psychological perspective, can you continuously be in the productive zone of learning, or do smart shocks necessitate a cool off period?
Great question. I You don't want to be in the continuously in the productive zone of learning. I think we'll all burn out. And you'll see in that diagram. And so if we think about the prolonged shock, moving in and out of that phase will be really important. So it's a great question. And for our sort of situational based shock, going into that zone for that period and then coming out, that's not to say that every day is going to be really stressful and challenging. It's that the kind of overall experience has pushed you into enough challenge that you're learning. And so, really great question. We want to make sure that, again, we're keeping people on that eustress side and the engaged side of stress. So, yeah, hopefully that helps clarify things. So you'll see on the slide here, we're really keen to keep the conversation going. We will share the copy of this webinar that we'd love, share it with others that you think might find this interesting, share the article. We're also running an Australian-based webinar too, which it is friendly enough for Canada time zone if you do have colleagues that want to come along. And so we'll share more details around that. But please don't be a stranger. We put our email addresses here, and we will share them outside of the webinar as well. Anything else, Melissa, that you'd like to say in closing?
All I want to say is thank you for joining us. I agree with Tessa. Keep the conversation going. And I think really what we're trying to do is, in a time where shocks are inevitable and have always been persistent and perhaps are becoming even more complex, our encouragement to folks on this is, how do you help to turn something that is a challenge, is an inevitability, into something that can really be harnessed for development and progress? And so it's a reframe. And so we encourage you to help us continue to refine and reframe the way in which this can work for you and alongside the work that you do. And we're very excited to continue extending how that can happen as well. So thank you.
Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us.